Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our monthly webinar. This is organized by the GLODAM Trainee Committee. And for our November webinar, we'll be having Professor Jonathan White speaking, and he'll be sharing some useful insights on manuscript writing. So as you can see on my slides, the topic is manuscript writing, essentials to increase your chances of getting published. So I'll be your host today. My name is Karen Waithera, and Dr. Pauline Ogola will be managing the chat function. So a few introductions on what the GLODAM Trainee Committee is. It is part of the International Alliance for Global Health Dermatology under the International Foundation for Dermatology. And our mission is to promote knowledge equity by enhancing access to dermatology education worldwide. So we have 3 key initiatives where we host educational webinars that are free, high quality, and provide learning opportunities. We also host networking and collaboration opportunities for connecting trainees worldwide. And we have a podcast series that you can catch either on Apple or on Spotify for addressing challenges in global health dermatology. So as part of the meeting etiquette today, you'll be muted for the entirety of the session and your camera will be turned off. Please submit any questions that you may have or any comments via the chat function. And for the questions via the Q&A function, our meeting host will share this with the speakers to answer at the end of the webinar. We'll also be sharing further information on the GLODAM Trainee Committee in the chat function. So more on our speaker, he's Professor Jonathan White, who is an English dermatologist working in the French-speaking hospital in Belgium. He has a key interest in skin allergies, inflammatory dermatosis, and occupational skin disease. And he has training program director for South Thames for 5 years for dermatology trainees, and also educational coordinator for all London dermatology trainees for 10 years. And he's been a consultant dermatologist for the last nearly 20 years. So Dr. White is passionate about dermatology education, and he's part of the panel developing a pan-European dermatology curriculum. He's based in Brussels in Belgium. So thank you, and we look forward to the presentation by Professor Jonathan White. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I hope you can all hear me. Hopefully that's good. So I'm going to share my screen now. I hope you can all see that.
Yes, you can.
Great. Okay, well, just to start off, thank you to the organisers for inviting me. It's always a privilege, and I am a very keen member of the GLODAM family. So there will be my email at the end, and if any of you have any questions that you don't want to bring up now, then we can discuss it by email at a later stage. But this is all going to be talking about how to write a good manuscript and how, therefore, to increase your chances of getting published, which is what many of us would like to do. So perhaps I can start off with a question to you all about how many of you have actually already published something. So if you even just published one thing as a co-author, then you can put in the chat yes. And if you've never published anything, then you can put no. So I'd be interested, and perhaps Pauline, you can tell me what people are saying, how many people have already published already. So we've got 2 yeses so far, 3 yeses, yes, lots of people. Okay, so that's great. So the brilliant thing is that you will know a lot about this already, those people, but there may be some people who've never published anything. So we're going to go through the whole thing and just see how we can increase the chances. There we go. So these are my affiliations and potential conflict of interest. So I'm co-editor-in-chief of the journal Contact Dermatitis, which specializes in skin allergies. So I have some insight into this because of, being an editor as well as being somebody who's submitted things before. So there are lots of scientific articles that are published. And in fact, in 2020, there were 2 million articles published that year in medical journals. And in 2022, there were like nearly double of that. So massive increase, and this was something that was seen quite extensively with the COVID epidemic, that people just started publishing a lot because they had more time. There are things like open access journals. So these are open to everybody without a subscription. And there are more and more of them. In fact, every day, pretty much, I am contacted by an open access journal saying they want content. They would encourage me to submit something or even guest edit an edition of the journal and so forth. And as your name gets known and as you get published, you will be invited to these things as well. There are also journals that are pay for submission, or pay for publication. Sometimes it can be quite expensive, like $3,000 or more to publish. And some of these journals have a very a marketing model where they're making a lot of money by people paying to get published. Some of these journals are not referenced in standard search engines like PubMed and other things. So the question is, do you really want to publish in those things? But just to say that they will be contacting you for submissions. So getting published is a nice thing because it is like a permanent record on your CV as to the work you've done. And it's like a recognition of all the hard work that you've all been doing. So that's quite a nice thing. It also can be helpful in terms of a career, to show people that you can get the job done. And that's really the thing I look for on a CV, is to see signs that show that this is a person who can get things done. They don't just take on jobs and then never finish it. This is like they can take the whole thing and finish the project. So it's a nice way of showing that. It's not the only way of doing that, but it is something that interviewers will look for. And therefore, the question is, how do you get published? How can you increase your chances of getting your research published? Well, the most important factor in all of that, whether you get published or not, and whether you get published in a good journal, is whether your research is of good quality. Because, there are exceptions. Sometimes there are really strange or dodgy, funny, strange studies that get published in good journals, and there is sometimes really good research that never gets published. So, but generally speaking, the higher quality your research is, the more likely it is going to be accepted. So what makes a good research paper? Well, the thing I think is important to do, and I think is useful as an exercise, is to think about a scientific paper that has impressed you or changed your practice. Because basically, if there's something that's really made a big difference to you as a clinician, that's the sort of article that you want to be producing yourself. So I would like you to think about that. And is there anything that you've read recently that you think could be really good? What was it about this paper that made it memorable? So was it something really original? Was it something that was maybe not so original, but it gives a different look at the problem? How did you hear about this paper? That's another thing to think about when you're trying to publish your own work. Is it a journal that you normally read? Did you hear about it from a colleague? Is it on an automatic AI search tool where you are signed up for notifications about particular areas of scientific research? Or was it discussed in a journal club where you're working? Or has somebody mentioned this paper in a congress or a conference you were attending, or something like that? So again, that can give you insight about how people access journal articles. It's very different now over the last 5 or 10 years. This has changed a lot. People previously they subscribed to a journal, or they would read this particular journal at their own hospital library or university library. But now people are accessing increasingly online, one by one. So they're not reading a whole issue of the journal, and in fact, some journals are not even printed anymore. So it's all online. So the question is, how do you get to hear about this paper? Because that might give you insights about how you can get your thing published, but also about thinking about ways we acquire knowledge. How do you access the work? Is it via an institutional subscription? Are you a member of a society which gives you free access to journals? So, for instance, the journal I am editor-in-chief of is available to all members of the European Society of Contact Dermatitis for free once you've paid your subscription. And there can be many other links like this with other societies and journals. So you're going to, hopefully, this paper that impressed you, you're going to use it as a template for your own work in the future. So actually, this is a memorable paper for me. So I don't want you to, it's quite technical, it's quite specific for skin allergy, but this was a paper that really impressed me, and also that is going to change the way I practice. So, and it's a paper looking about 2 known allergens and which are commonly in gloves. So surgical examination gloves, latex and nitrile. And it's looking about different areas of this in terms of patch testing syringes, so the material we use for the patch testing in humans, but they also did some experiments on pig skin as well. So to illustrate the point, here we go, your research really should be hypothesis driven. And how do you generate a hypothesis? Well, it's on a series of observations. So for instance, in this paper, the first observation was that these 2 types of chemicals, thiorams and carbamates, they are similar chemically, so they have properties in common. The second observation was that carbamates are found more in gloves than thiorams. So if you analyze the gloves, latex or nitrile, you'll find more carbamate than you will find thioram. But this is strange because people who are allergic to gloves, they more commonly respond to thiorams on patch testing rather than the carbamates. So this is a seeming discrepancy. We wouldn't expect that from the observations too. So why could this happen? Well, this is why you need to develop hypothesis, and the authors developed this hypothesis that conversion between thiorams and carbamates in the patch test material happens, and perhaps also on the skin in real life conditions. So then you need to think about how you're going to test this hypothesis. And, often if you're looking at a problem and you're testing a hypothesis, it's maybe done one way, but if there's a way of looking at the same thing in maybe 2 or even 3 different ways, then it's much more convincing. So you're looking at the same problem from 3 different angles. And therefore, if all of the ways you're testing, the 2 or 3 different ways you're testing, show the same result, and they confirm or reject the hypothesis, then that's much more convincing to the reviewer and then to the readers of that article in the future. So in this study, both in vitro and in vivo methods were used to test the hypothesis. So before starting, you need to think about this finer approach, and this stands for feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, and relevant. So this is just a way of thinking about the research you're doing. Does it meet those things, basically? So let's talk about that in more detail. So is the study that I'm going to do, is it feasible? Can I do this research? Have I got enough time? What are the costs? Is it practical? Because you may have a fantastic idea for something, but actually, if this idea costs $50 million and it's going to take 30 years, then it's unlikely that you're going to be able to do that on your own, and so forth. So you need to cost it out. You need to think about the time. Can you give enough time to this? The other thing I would tell you from personal experience is that sometimes you get involved with research, but then if you're on a rotation, you're moving around, maybe you're junior and you're going to be in a different place, then you never see the results and never see the research finished. And then by the time that the researchers are writing this up and publishing it, they've forgotten that you maybe started all of this. So maybe you'll have done the hard work, like getting the ethical committee approval, setting up the trial, identifying subjects for it, but actually you don't get any recognition for that. So you need to be realistic about what is achievable, what you can achieve. Another key feature of this is it interesting? Would I be interested to read this if it were published, or is it quite boring, not very original, and so forth? So, is there a need here? Is there an unmet need that I'm going to fill with this research? Novelty is, of course, very important. So, has this stuff done before? Because there have been many times where I've had I think, a good idea, and then you think, this is great, I can do this, it's feasible, it's interesting. And then you find somebody's published the same thing. So you need to do a really good literature search before you even start a project, because it's awful when you find it's already been published. Maybe it's been done better. Maybe they've got more patients than you could ever have. So, there's no point in starting research where you're just doing the same thing as other people and there's no message, no learning point to it. So there needs to be some new angle to this, some novel feature that's going to allow it to be important and to be published. Of course, all of our research should be ethical. So we know that in the first principle of medicine is do no harm. So we need to be sure what we're doing, that this has been approved by an ethics committee. And I've put here that even for a retrospective case record research, so you're going back to the records, you're not changing any treatments, you're just looking back retrospectively what has been done, and maybe you're analyzing that in an interesting way. But even for that now, most journals will insist that you have ethics committee approval. And sometimes this is quite difficult to get and can be a lengthy procedure. So in Belgium, for my own research and so forth, it can take 6 months or more to get a reply from the ethics committee. You need to decide whether you need to do a placebo or not, for instance. You need to decide whether it's ethical to do a placebo. So, for instance, in some ways, for an established treatment, it would be unethical to deprive somebody of a treatment by giving them a placebo. So often you can compare with the standard treatment, for instance. So you need to think about all these considerations, ethical considerations, because the ethics committee will be asking about them. Is the research relevant? So will this research make a difference? It's good to do basic research for things, but actually, what is it going to achieve? Does it take us anywhere in terms of this journey from the laboratory bench to the bedside? Does it help us in this journey of helping our patients or not? So then what about the choice of topic? So the first thing is, I think it's always great to get opinions from other people in the field, because they have maybe a lot of experience. They may be able to guide you about research that is interesting, novel, ethical, and so forth. And maybe where there is a hole in our knowledge, a gap, so we don't know something that's important, and they may be able to guide you towards that, and it may not be obvious to you at the beginning. So are there gaps in the literature? The other thing is that often I was involved with the writing of the guidelines for the management of atopic dermatitis in Belgium, and with occupational dermatitis guidelines in the UK. And as part of that process, we are supposed to identify gaps in the knowledge. So, what are there that is unknown that needs to be addressed? So that could be a really good source of ideas of what research needs to be done. And this has been identified by experts in the field. Similarly, review papers also, so systematic reviews and other things, may identify gaps in our knowledge, and they may be helpful. And again, discussions at conferences where the speakers will say, there are things unknown, we don't know this, it's basically unknown, we don't have the data, etc., etc. So this can identify some gaps if you don't already have ideas. The other thing I would definitely recommend is that if you're working in a place where they have a lot of interest or expertise in one particular area, then it's going to be easier for you to launch your research project. So if you are starting and there's nobody has ever done this in your area before, then it can be difficult. It can be done. And in fact, as a GloDerm mentor, for instance, last year, my mentee from Mali, Bakari, has just started something up from scratch. So it can be done, but it's more difficult. And if you can already go on the back of other research, then that can be helpful. Because maybe those patients that are already there being seen, the cohort is already in place. Maybe there's even a registry of this particular disease or this treatment, and you can access all of that data in an easy way. So, although if you want to try something completely new, but actually look at the strengths already, maybe there have been publications, research done in this area already where you're working. You may need to consider doing a pilot study to test the new waters. So rather than do a big project where you're committing a lot of money, which maybe you don't have, or maybe it's going to be difficult, maybe you need to do a small study first to see whether this is feasible as an idea. And then you can publish those findings before you then do a big study ultimately. So maybe a pilot study. Maybe you need to do a literature search and a scoping review, for instance, of a new area. Is there any evidence? Is there any suggestion in the literature about this? So this choice of topic is very important. Moving on, so generally, I think if your methodology and results sections are good, the rest of the paper writes itself. Because if you've selected your topic carefully, and if you've designed the study carefully, and if the results section is great, then basically everything else is just dressing on the top, or icing on the top of the cake, if you will. So let's talk about methodology briefly now. So which trial structure is most appropriate? Because there can be many things that, that might address the question, but which one is the best way of doing this and the best way that is feasible? Is there adequate power for the study? Because it's really frustrating when you get these results and it doesn't reach statistical significance because maybe you just didn't have enough people recruited. And now the recruitment's finished, you've run out of your funds, and actually ultimately it's unpublishable because you've got nothing really to report. So you need to think about the number of subjects. And I would definitely advise you, if at all possible, to get advice from a biostatistician when you're setting up your trial structure, because they will be able to guide you about how many people you need to include, how you're going to evaluate the hypothesis, primary endpoints, secondary endpoints, and so forth. Don't forget, you need a hypothesis first. You can't, I think it's a bad idea if you have a big data set, and then you suddenly say, well, let's just analyze it in 100 different ways and see what comes out. And then we'll generate a hypothesis from there. That's a very weak and a very lazy and not a very good way, in my opinion, of doing this research. You need to have a hypothesis first and then examine the data to see whether it's backed up or not. Otherwise, you're just going to get complete bias all over the place. So do not analyze the data to generate hypothesis. Let's move on to results. Well, usually you want to describe the study cohort and the demographic features. And in some things, like in skin allergy, there are a number of defined criteria for the demographics that we need to think about. Don't forget to report on those who declined to participate, those lost to follow-up, or those who had to stop the study because of an adverse event. These people are really, and any proper journal will be asking you, well, just a minute, you recruited 150 people, but we only have results from 75 people. So where are the rest of them? And this is really important because it could completely invalidate your findings potentially. So it's really important that people who are lost, you need to report them and think about why they were lost to follow up, for instance. You need to have your prior defined endpoints. both primary, secondary, or other ones. So you know exactly how you're measuring this, what is going to be a positive result or a negative result. You've defined it before you even start analysing the data. Obviously, blinding can be important to reduce the chances of bias. I would also suggest in the results section, when you're writing it, is not to overload the reader with too many tables. Sometimes, people submit things and there are like 25 tables, and, it's a bit too much, really. So you can put any accessory data. So maybe that data is important and needs to be reported, but maybe it doesn't need to be in the main bit of the results section in the write-up. So you could put it into an annex, or some journals have online resources, so you can go, even sometimes the references or other things from the paper are put into this online resource. So it's a separate thing from the main referenceable paper. The other thing that I would really strongly recommend that you do is to get somebody who is not involved in the study to read it, because sometimes we are all so close to the project, we understand it, we've set it up, we've done the ethics, everything, that we don't really realize when we're writing it up that there are maybe things that we're not mentioning that mean to say that you can't really understand or follow the results. So getting somebody else to read it and see what they think is, or obviously your co-authors are going to read it, but somebody not involved with the study as well, because they can sometimes say, hey, I don't understand, why did you take these people in the first place? Or they might have some really good questions. So if you can get somebody else to read it, maybe your husband or wife or a colleague or a friend who was not directly involved in the study, that can be very helpful. Conclusions should not really introduce any new results or data. So don't forget, the conclusion is just to pull everything together. So you've got the results. Now there's your interpretation of the results. What does it mean? What the impact of these results going to be for the future? How could it change things and so forth? So all of your original data should be included in the results section, and that should have been described adequately in the methodology so that people can reproduce this. The other thing is that you should really be including limitations of the study and other research questions. So for instance, you may say, well, it would have been very nice to do the study in people over the age of 80, but unfortunately we couldn't recruit anybody of that age. So that's maybe to be looked at in a different study, or whatever it happens to be. There could be many different limitations of the study. The reviewers are probably going to bring this up, so it's good to anticipate that. So you can say, well, actually, we know that there was this gap, and it would have been nice to get extra data, but actually we couldn't for whatever reason. So you're kind of hopefully staying one step ahead of the reviewers. Okay, let's move on now to the actual write-up of the paper. So we're going to talk about general things, and this applies to full research papers, but it also applies to everything else that you write. So it could be a grant application, it could be to a submission, an abstract for a conference presentation, or other things. So this is general considerations. It's obvious that the text needs to be clear, but so you need to keep things simple. Ideally, you're going to have a very clear text that it's easy to follow it. So you need to avoid very long, complicated sentences. In some languages, this is very common, but English is not great for long sentences because the grammatical structure of the language, you need to be fairly concise. Short sentences are usually understood better. Ideally, you want to avoid using the passive voice, so the active voice is prepared. So, for instance, 4 patients were randomly selected and informed to fill out the questionnaire. Well, it's passive, isn't it? So they were somehow informed to do this, but actually we selected 4 patients randomly and we informed them to fill out. That sounds much more positive, more definite. It sounds more clear, really. So I would definitely think about this passive voice, because it can creep into everything, and the whole paper is just passive voice all the time. I think it sounds much punchier, better, clearer when it's in the active voice. I would also say be careful of using artificial intelligence or lengthy quotes from other people, because actually the paper will be analysed for content generated by AI. So it may flag up as being, you've maybe falsified this and it's not your own work, but actually it is. So you need to be very transparent about that and declare it. So if your paper, in my own journal, all the papers are analysed for AI content, and if it's flagged very highly and if the editor has suspicions, the paper will be rejected before it's even sent out for review. So this is really important. And if you've used some AI to maybe translate the paper into English, then I think you need to declare that at the end, because things that are searched for on most AI systems like ChatGPT and things like that, there are traces of that, the thing you've asked or the translation will be there, and people might find it and think that this is all AI generated. So you need to declare it really if you're using that. So in terms of the write-up, again, this may sound very obvious, but actually the title is the most important thing of the whole thing, because if your title doesn't really describe very well what's going on, nobody, even if it gets published, is ever going to be able to find this article. As I say, this is particularly important now because people are choosing and accessing articles one by one. So they're looking at that subject area and they're selecting that one article. They're not just going through the journal and reading lots of things and, oh, that's a surprise. So they've got to be actively looking for it. And if your title isn't right, they're not going to be able to, even if they're looking for it, they're not going to be able to find it. The title should be short, and of course, sometimes it can't be short. So if possible, the shorter the better. And it should be informative about what's going on. So for instance, you might have a title of a paper, a retrospective study on hidradenitis suppurativa. Well, it says nothing about what's in that paper, apart from you've looked at this one condition and you've looked retrospectively. It doesn't really tell you anything about it. It's not making me interested to read that paper. It doesn't tell you anything. So a better title might be something like a retrospective study on hidradenitis suppurativa in elderly people. So now we know, okay, it's HAS, but we're looking at an older population here, which is perhaps more unusual for that particular condition. But even better, to give more information, hidradenitis suppurativa is not uncommon in elderly people. A retrospective study using the Belgian registry. So for instance, here we're saying, okay, we see hidradenitis suppurativa in elderly people. It's actually more common than we think. And actually, we've used a special registry retrospectively to analyze this data. So it's giving you lots of information. So the title is longer, but we had to include that longer title really, so that you can tell people what's in the paper. You also need to think very carefully about keywords. So I have to say, years ago, I was as guilty as everybody else. You do the whole paper, you're really happy, you submit it, oh my goodness, the keywords, I've completely forgotten. So just put anything down, any old thing, fine. But actually, you really need to think very carefully, because again, those keywords are going to be fed into the algorithms, which will mean your paper could be found or paper you're not going to be found. And it's amazing doing systematic reviews how sometimes the keywords, they don't really contain key elements of the paper, so you don't actually find them. And you only find them when you're, by chance, when you're looking at other references, for instance. So really pay attention. The title and the keywords, they're the most important thing. So we're going to have a bit of an interactive thing here. So this is a paper that I saw recently, and I think this title is really good because it's telling you lots of things. It's quite long, but I think the title needed to be long in this case. So I think this is a good title: Unexpected Hepatotoxicity in Psoriasis, Deranged Liver Enzymes and Steatosis Secondary to Secukinumab Treatment. So we now know it's talking about this biological treatment, but actually we know it can cause damage to the liver, but this is unexpected, and what kind of liver damage you can get with this new treatment. I would have preferred really to know what they're using secukinumab for. Was it for psoriasis? Was it for another condition? But, anyway. But I'd like you now to think about, this is a good title. How do we make it into a bad one? So maybe you can put your ideas in the chat now. And then, Pauline, I don't know if you could maybe read out some of those titles that people are suggesting. And we can think about, so instead of trying to make a bad thing good, we're going to make a good thing bad here. And it will give you some insight into thinking about how to make your title. So, Pauline, do we have anybody in the chat?
So no one yet.
Well, keep the ideas coming. And I'm going to suggest we're going to look at some of the ones I've come up with. So, for instance, toxicity to biologics in psoriasis. Well, that tells you nothing. Yeah. Oh, that's a nice one. Thanks, Maria. Liver function of patients on psoriasis secukinumab. So yeah, so that tells you nothing. Doesn't tell you that there's a bad effect, does it? So, for instance, another title might be psoriasis, unexpected toxicity, 5 cases of toxicity from a tertiary center. Yeah, another one. Thanks, Doreen. Secukinumab and hepatotoxicity. Yeah, so this gives you an idea of, yes, it's short, but actually maybe it's not enough to be able to find this paper in the future. So somebody looking for secukinumab side effects, they're going to find this paper easily. Let's move on to another one. I thought this was a good title as well, from the Journal of Investigative Dermatology, a recent paper just from a few weeks ago, a prospective randomized trial of microneedle radiofrequency combined with low-dose isotretinoin versus isotretinoin alone for acne vulgaris treatment. So I think this is a great title because it's telling me a lot about this study. It's telling me that we're acne vulgaris patients. We're comparing these two treatment options, one the tablet alone, one a tablet with a microneedling technique. And also, this is a prospective randomized trial. So that's really important. All that information is really important. So how do you think we can make this into a bad title? Have you got any ideas? Put it in the chat. And hopefully it will come up. Oh. Pauline, anybody come up with some ideas? Oh. Yes, isotretinoin versus microneedle, yeah, in acne vulgaris. Yeah, that gives us less information. Well, I've got a few here. So similar to, yeah, this is, thanks, Maria. Acne vulgaris treatment, which is best, a randomized trial of acne treatments. So you can imagine what's the bad thing, so you're going to avoid that in future. Okay, apart from the title, the abstract is the most important part of the manuscript, and about a quarter of decisions are made on the basis of reviewing based on the abstract alone. And this is really frightening because if your abstract's not right, or if you've just cut and pasted a little bit from your results section or your conclusion, well, then it's unlikely you're going to get the the paper published. The other thing is that many people quote papers and they have only read the abstract. So your abstract better be good, because that's sometimes the only data they're going on. I mean, definitely don't do that yourself. Always read the paper, because not everybody takes care of their abstract. It may be misleading, the abstract, compared with the data published in the rest. Some publications don't actually link an abstract, and this is a real problem if you want to be cited, because, yeah, you want to be published, but also you want to be cited by other people. So you want your work to be important, for other people to be quoting you. And that's for academic reasons. You get like an index, citations index, which some people have very high, some people have lower levels. So this is a barrier to getting your article cited if there's no abstract, and it may influence your choice of journal. So only the most important results to go in the abstract. Choose the key ones. You don't have to put everything. You shouldn't put everything in there necessarily. And be really brutal in paring down the number of words so you get the most impact from the number of words you've got in the abstract. Ideally, for the write-up, you want to have a native speaker to review the manuscript if possible, avoid repetition, and actually the editing process that you do yourself, going down, reducing the text, almost always is going to improve things in terms of clarity, getting rid of the unnecessary words, paring it down to the essentials. It sounds like an obvious one, but it's really important to follow the style guide of the target journal, because some of the editors will get very annoyed if you haven't done that, and they may reject it because of that. So think about the reference style and other house rules. They may have rules about abbreviations and other things. So you don't want to annoy the reviewers or the editors. You want them to be happy and pleased with the manuscript, so they'll be more favorable, hopefully. Look at the limits for the type of article and follow them. So look at the type of articles that are published: original article, letter to the editor, or whatever else it happens to be. Look at the word count, look at the type of articles they're looking for as well. And be absolutely ruthless. Make sure that when you submit that paper that you followed the word count, because actually the editing will improve the text, but also some people are just looking to reject, and they'll reject if it's over the word count. And then it's the whole process of submitting again, which is time consuming. Don't forget to have all of the listed authors read through the text before submission and make sure they're happy for you to submit it on their behalf. I have had cases of people submitting things with me as an author. I've not even seen the paper, and it's a really bad move, and it gets people quite annoyed. So now we can talk about the choice of journal. So you've got your paper, and it's all great, looking great, original, well written, etc. So which journal do you go for? Well, you can look at the impact factor, which is roughly like a citations thing. There are other indices they use for choosing this. So you could look at that and say, well, actually, one of the top impact factors for dermatology, that might be the one I'm going to go for. So that's one possible way of thinking about it. But actually, I would suggest that you look at your own references first. That will give you an idea of which journals are interested in these things and what we're going to do. What sort of journal publishes in this area? You need to think about the target journal versus high impact, because, for instance, my own area, cutaneous allergy, the target journal is contact dermatitis, but that doesn't, maybe you can get it published somewhere else with a higher impact factor, but the people who are doing patch testing read contact dermatitis. So it's going to get through to the people you're targeting perhaps more than going for a higher impact factor. And who do you want to read this article? Is it primary care physicians? Is it dermatologists? Is it orthopedic surgeons? It could be anybody. It could be the general public. National versus international, open access. So many journals have open access, and there are transitional agreements with our own journal, for instance, if you're from a country with difficulty getting the resources. And the problem of placing case reports, it's a nightmare. There are some journals that target these. Most journals don't like case reports because it actually brings down their own impact factor. So it's difficult where to get case reports published without having to pay a fee. Do consider the Community Skin Health Journal, which is great. And if you don't know that, look it up already. So we talked about that already. I'm going to have to speed up a little bit because we're running out of time. So don't forget, you need to check with all the authors that they're happy for submission, follow the instructions carefully, plan a short cover letter to the editor, and make sure that you've uploaded all of the consent forms that you need to, or the conflict of interest files, because again, you're going to get rejected if you've not done all of that. I'm going to give you a little short overview of the peer review process. So normally the article is vetted to make sure that the subject matter is in the scope of the journal. And sometimes it's completely wrong. So it needs to be channeled to another journal. The editor-in-chief will normally select a handling editor to navigate the review process. And then they usually invite at least 2, maybe sometimes more, reviewers to look at the paper and to give a detailed review. it's really difficult and increasingly difficult to find suitable reviewers. And they're often given, in our journal anyway, 2 weeks. It can be longer for certain other journals to complete the review. Then they make the suggestions about outcome of the review process, but ultimately the handling editor will decide whether they agree with what the reviewer said or come with a different outcome. So the main outcomes that you can have are complete acceptance. That's unusual with the first version, but sometimes you accept it first off. You can have a major revision where there's some major things that need to be reviewed or changed. A minor revision, so the few things, maybe the phrasing, maybe something in the discussion section needs to be do that. Reject and resubmit, or an outright reject. And you can target those to a different journal if you want to. And you're sent as the submitter, you're sent an email to inform about the decision. So if a revision is requested, do go through the care efforts commonly and address each one. And then some of them like a clean version and a track changes version, so you know what's been changed. Address the points in a separate letter saying why you've chosen to respond in a particular way. But of course, check with your co-authors before you submit this. Do not necessarily accept all the points made by one reviewer. Fight your corner. Sometimes it's the wrong thing to accept everything and change everything as they're saying. And you may have good reasons, but you need to discuss that in the letter to the handling editor if you're not going to do that. If you get a really detailed review that's going over many pages, actually, this probably means they're going to accept it because nobody's going to write that amount of stuff if it's hopeless research. So actually, you need to go through the points and address them, but you don't necessarily have to accept all of them. So this is a paper that I wrote years ago. The title is Rubbish. Nobody's really accessed it. It's a really fantastic study. And really, I made some errors as a more junior consultant. And that actually, I should have said no to them when they insisted on this title and so forth. So it's a shame, but, I've learned from it. What do you do if the review rejects the manuscript? Well, you look at the comments. And actually, you can use those comments to reformulate the manuscript and try and get it published elsewhere. So that's good. Maybe consider a different journal, maybe a pacer published journal, and try again. And the reason I put this on about cannabis sativa allergy is because this was rejected from 3 journals. And during COVID, I basically rewrote it and submitted it somewhere else and managed to get it published because it was an interesting point, I think. So how can I improve my publishing skills? Well, practice makes perfect. Listen to the other people who are doing this with you. Sometimes the most junior co-author can have brilliant ideas. Listen to their advice. Take the reviewer's comments on board. Often they're right. And you need to have some thinking time about your research. I'd say 30 minutes a day, if possible, to have a think about where you're going forward. So you're not rushing, because it's rushing that will mean you make mistakes. And it will mean the manuscript might be rejected. You need to plan ahead and be organized for the deadlines, of course, as well. And the other thing you can do is to learn from reviewing other people's articles, because actually that's a really good learning process. And it's easy to criticize other people's work, more difficult to criticize our own work because we're too close to it. So reviewing other people's work can really be helpful. There are some resources here which you can look at. Certainly, there's the Glowdome family is a fantastic resource to tap into for advice. And the other thing I would say is that if any of you are interested in reviewing articles for contact dermatitis, then just email me saying that you're interested, and I can then send you an invitation to review a simple article. You don't have to have any special knowledge. It's just about those things we're talking about, finer. Whether it's good, whether it's good research, novel, interesting, well-written, and so forth. So I'm very happy. If any of you have any questions you don't have time to discuss now, you can email me at a later date. But I think, Pauline, we're ready for the questions now, if anybody is ready.
Thank you so much, Professor Jonathan White, for the wonderful lecture. I think we've learned a lot. We have a number of questions. The first one says, how can I begin to find reading research papers interesting when I have typically only read them as part of my required school reading?
Okay. Well, I think that's a really good question because actually, you know, the whole field of dermatology is so vast that it's where do you begin? And the way I think you begin is to do targeted reading around the patients you're seeing. So you see a patient with some condition and they've got really bad psoriasis, for instance, and you think, they're on this treatment, it's not working. Maybe I need to do a literature review and see what's been published recently. Maybe there's some new guidelines, maybe there's some new treatment ideas. And then you can hang the research you're reading on the patients that you're dealing with because it makes it much more relevant. And then you can discuss with your colleagues, oh, have you thought about this other treatment? Have you thought about this? Maybe we need to rotate the treatments or whatever else. So I think that's the way I would start. Once you get into your particular subspecialty area of dermatology, like maybe you're interested in infections, maybe you're interested in albinism, maybe you're interested in acne, psoriasis, whatever, then it becomes much more interesting because you're dealing with these issues. You need to know and you want to know what the new things are.
Thank you. Second question says, how do I know I've done a proper literature review? Is there a guideline or recommended number of papers to read prior to writing a manuscript?
No, not really, because it depends on the subject area, because there are some areas where there's like nothing been published ever, or maybe one case report or something like that. So I think you need to think about the search words you're using for the search, literature search. Could there be a synonym, for instance, that another name for the same thing and you just didn't know about it? So actually the ICD-11 site, I've already declared my conflict of interest here, but so that's good because it gives you synonyms for these conditions. Basically there's no limit because it just depends what you're looking at. I mean, obviously, if you're doing a literature search on psoriasis or atopic dermatitis, there's going to be millions of references. So you need to hone it down a bit, really. But the other thing is, if there's a review article on this, often they've done a very meticulous literature search. So that will give you an idea. Have I missed any papers? Is there anything really important I've not cited here? But it's basically up to you to do the search really and see, but there's no limit really.
How can I gauge when it is appropriate for them to defend, for me, I guess, to defend my point of view against the peer review process?
Well, I think, again, generally speaking, what the reviewer is saying is going to be right because they're chosen as experts in the field and so forth. But actually, there's sometimes where you feel quite strongly that, no, I don't think that one reviewer has really understood the point I'm making. And actually, I don't want to change the title because of these reasons. So the easy option is just to say, do whatever the reviewer says. But there may be the odd time, and you obviously need to discuss this with your senior authors and other people, actually, and you can then say, well, actually, we're resubmitting this paper, but that one point, we didn't really agree with it because of X, Y, and Z. And then it's up to the editor to decide. So, and in fact, I once had a paper rejected and I wrote to the editor separately and said, look, this has been rejected. I think the comments were a bit unfair. I was wondering if maybe you could have a look at it and see what you think. And he said, yeah, I think it's been a bit unfair. And he reallocated to other reviewers and then it was accepted. So just to say, generally speaking, go with the comments that the reviewers say. But there may be times where it's a good thing to fight your corner a little bit. So it's a discretionary thing. You have to discuss it with your senior authors, I think.
The next question asks, how important is the journal impact factor when selecting a journal to submit my paper to?
Well, it's one of the factors, I think, but there are many other things. So, for instance, when I'm publishing something about skin allergies, I'm not necessarily going to go for the highest impact factor one because actually the target journal is the one about contact dermatitis. So if I want my message to go out to the majority of people doing patch testing, then I'm better to put my article in that slightly lower impact factor one than a higher one. But it depends what you want, really. I mean, but impact factor is only one measure. So I think it's finding the right home for your article is the good thing. And as I say, your own references will tell you what journals are interested in that area and so forth. So, some people who've got a really academic career, they want to have highest citations and all the rest of it. They maybe go for a higher impact journal, but that's not always the right decision. So I think you have to think about it case by case, really.
Another attendee asks, I have submitted my manuscript since July. I have followed up on the handling editor, has not yet made decision whether they are accepting it or not. Why is it taking so long?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question. And I'm sure it's because they're having difficulty finding reviewers. I mean, I've sometimes send articles out and like 8, 10, 15 people will refuse to review it. So you're just waiting. They get a week or two to respond to the email. And then before you know it, I mean, it's months down the line. I think Marluce is online as well. And she's had a paper that was in review for like over a year. I've got a paper at the moment that's been in review for 9 months. It's the WHO bulletin. So, unfortunately, it's because reviewing is unpaid. You're relying on people doing it out of the goodness of their heart. There are maybe only a small number of people who are competent to review that particular article. So I think you've done the right thing by checking with the editor and saying it's not been forgotten. And then maybe you can suggest reviewers, if they're having problems finding a reviewer, maybe you can suggest people. Obviously, it has to be people that are not your friends, who are not in your research group and so on. But, you can write to the editor and suggest some reviewers and that's in fact the way that one of Marluce's papers was accepted in the end.
Thank you. Jacqueline from Brazil asks, as I am not a native speaker, I have a lot of difficulty to write the article. How can I improve this? Is it better if I write in Portuguese and then translate?
Yeah, different people do different things. I have to say, it really depends on how good your English is or not. I think it's fine to use like AI to do a translation. AI is not so good for minority languages. I mean, it's perhaps best for English, Spanish, probably Portuguese is okay. I don't know. But for some smaller languages, the translation is not so good. So I think you always want to have somebody giving a critical eye if you're going to use AI to do the translation. But I think you also use it as your model. Obviously, you don't want to write it word for word, but other papers will give you the terminology. When you've done a literature search and you're quoting 15 papers that you've read, or for instance, on that area, that will give you the sort of vocabulary and everything that you need. That can be helpful. But obviously, there's the GLODEM family who can help as well, hopefully.
Thank you. And Malu has replied to you in the chat.
Yeah, Malu said, 2 experiences took 1 year. Advice to inquire the editor after 2 to 3 months sometimes helps. Yeah. So, and it shows that you're interested, you're keen, and all the rest of it. So I think that's probably the way forward. But do be understanding, because I can tell you it's a nightmare as an editor trying to find people who are competent to review some very specialized and technical papers.
So thank you so much, Professor Jonathan White. I think we've all learned a lot. The top thing I've learned is that I shouldn't rush the process. So I'll be more patient with myself during the literature review process and even during the peer review process. So thank you so much.
Oh, thanks to you all for attending. I'm really pleased to be here, and do feel free to email me if you have any specific questions.
Thank you. So thank you all for attending today. This webinar was hosted by the GLODEM Trainee Committee, and we'd like to also thank our supporters who are the CeraV, Care for All, and the Ellis Foundation. So for more information, you can follow us on our social media pages, and Pauline has shared some links in the chat function. Thank you. See you next month.
Goodbye.